Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229. This is our class for Monday, the 13th of September. So basically, last class I did an introduction where I reviewed the syllabus and the course outline, and I asked all of you to briefly introduce yourselves on our class discussion forum. And you would have seen that I have responded to each of you. And I had indicated that you don't need to respond to your classmates, but do read all of the responses and my responses. And again, if you're moved to respond to any of your classmates, certainly do so in the way that you would participate in a live class. And the one piece that I did not have a chance to get to in regards to review of the syllabus was the plagiarism section, which I'm sure is probably something that you've heard about in other classes, but I just wanted to briefly review. And basically, plagiarism is using somebody else's language or somebody else's ideas without giving credit. Because when you do give credit, that's when you're doing research, and that's an important component of college. But when you don't give credit, then you are presenting the information as if it were your own, and that would be comparable to theft. In this instance, intellectual theft. So you want to make sure that you are always giving the appropriate credit. And I always have two stories to share with my students to try to encourage them not to be tempted to plagiarize, which more often than not is a very deliberate kind of act. And the first happened to me very early on in my career, and I was reading a set of papers, and I realized that what I was reading sounded familiar. And I wasn't able to use the internet. This was in the infancy of the internet, so I couldn't use the internet to try to find where the source was. And as many sources that exist on the internet to help students plagiarize, there are probably an equal number of sites and sources that help teachers determine if students are plagiarizing. One of my favorites is called turnitin.com, where basically there is an electronic search over sentences and paragraphs to try to find the original source. But at any rate, I didn't have access to that. I needed to rely on my own memory. And it didn't take me long to figure out where I had read this before. Basically, it was in our own class textbook that I had assigned for the class. Remarkably so, as if I wouldn't recognize that. And there were a few mechanical errors in there. I don't know if this is because this person was a sloppy plagiarist or because they were hoping that there were a few errors in there, therefore I would assume it was their own writing. Nevertheless, the better story occurred around the same time period to a middle-aged professor. That part is important. And it was also in the very early days of the internet. It actually appeared in academic newspapers, what happened. He was reading a set of papers and also encountered some writing that looked familiar. And he was trying to rely on his memory for where he had read this before. And then he realized he hadn't read it, he wrote it. He had written it decades earlier when he was an undergraduate student. It was one of his old papers, and somehow, some way, it ended up in the hands of one of his current students. And I'm not sure of all of the details, but I know it has something to do with the fraternity that was recycling papers from previous brothers. And not only did this person plagiarize, and consequences can be pretty significant. If you get off easy, so to speak, you fail the assignment. But if you don't get off easy, you could be expelled with a notation on your transcript that you plagiarize. So it's a pretty significant thing. But not only did this student get caught plagiarizing, but the student was also plastered in the media about the irony of handing in his professor's own work from decades earlier. So I always share those two stories to encourage you not to plagiarize. The sorts of writing that we'll be doing this semester are the kinds of writing that probably will discourage plagiarism. You have, as we talked about last class, a good number of informal writing assignments where you are responding to the Gothic texts we're reading over the course of the semester. I'm calling those journals, about a page or so of reflections and questions and thoughts based on your own reading, the classroom discussion forums, and also my videos. And then ultimately, there will be two academic papers. They will be critical papers. In other words, they're not research papers. I'm not going to be asking you to look up outside resources. That said, if you had your heart set on a research paper, we could negotiate because I like to be flexible. But basically, the idea is that your response in that academic paper is based on your own learning that you've acquired over the course of the semester. So I'm hopeful that my two stories will stay with you if you are ever in a position where you might be tempted to plagiarize. I kind of liken it to cheating on your taxes. It's not hard to do and it's tempting to do, but if you get caught, oh boy, you're in trouble. So basically, if you've got any questions or concerns about the syllabus or the course outline, please let me know. Remember, I've got time set aside in class for optional chats and Zooms, but you can always contact me via email or telephone as well. So what I had assigned for today, very optimistically, because I know that students are still adding and dropping, and you may not necessarily have had a chance to get to the textbook, was a set of readings by Stephen King, his work Danse Macabre, which is not a piece of fiction. Basically, it's his review of the horror or the Gothic genre. He has a degree in English and actually has taught classes in supernatural literature, so he is well versed in the topic. And I was able to find a link online where you could find Danse Macabre. Now, honestly, I don't know how that works because of copyright, but I'm also not going to ask questions. I just know that I found a link and I'm going to include it in the notes below. And what I had assigned for us to read were 3 chapters: Invitation to Dance, Tales of the Hook, and Tales of the Tarot. But if you didn't have a chance to read it, please don't panic. And these are introductory readings, basically trying to set the foundation for what Gothic is and how we are going to go about approaching our reading and interpretations over the course of the semester. Our first Gothic text really begins with Frankenstein, and that is something that I encourage you to start reading now, even though we won't be talking about it for a couple of classes. And we have multiple classes devoted to Frankenstein. But ideally, at the beginning of the section for Frankenstein, you would have completed the text or have come close to it so that you could begin the next text in the semester, even though we're spending several classes discussing that particular text. And Frankenstein is the text you'll be writing your first journal on, so your journals won't be due for a little while. And certainly you can reference some of what we are talking about with Stephen King and what we will talk about with Lovecraft next class, supernatural horror and literature. But the real focus of the class begins with the text Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. But in Danse Macabre and this invitation to dance, Stephen King in that first chapter talks about this medieval term of Danse Macabre, which is the dance of death. And the idea that there's a kind of artistry associated with death, and there's also a universality associated with death. It's something that we all face. It's the great unknown. It oftentimes has been called the biggest fear of humankind. There's a woodcut image, and you'll see in the notes below that I included a link for you to be able to see it, of the Danse Macabre, where oftentimes you've got skeletons that are dancing in something like a graveyard. Whether or not death is indeed our biggest fear is something that we will be examining over the course of the semester. And in fact, it'll be something that we'll be talking about in today's discussion forum. But what I wanted to do was to point out how Stephen King, at least from his perspective, and he has a reputation as being one of the most probably well-known authors in the tradition of horror and Gothic, that there are 3 levels, according to him, of horror. What he calls the gross out. This is revulsion. It's the lowest level. It's basically trying to gross out someone, as opposed to the creeps, which is the middle level. This is where an audience feels a certain sense of anxiety or dread. And then finally, from his perspective, there's terror. And this is the highest level, and it's the fear of disestablishment. In other words, the fear of things falling apart. And the examination from King's perspective of national phobic pressure points occurs in the greatest level of horror, that which talks about terror. That horror is more than a literal story trying to frighten us, but it oftentimes is an allegory or a metaphor for many of the fears that we face ourselves in our own society, whether they be political, whether they be economic, whether they be psychological, or some combination thereof. And in fact, I mentioned to some of you in the discussion forum questions that I teach a class in horror film. and I am going to be giving a presentation around Halloween in the Lava Center, talking just about this very thing, about how horror films work on a symbolic or a metaphoric level. So symbolism is when we have one thing representing something else, and metaphor is when we are comparing two dissimilar things, and showing that they are more similar than dissimilar. And when we talk about allegory, it's usually about some sort of universal truth. And these are the literary terms that we often examine in classes of literature. Now, horror has oftentimes been viewed as a kind of genre writing that's fairly lowbrow, and it can be written mostly for entertainment and for profit. But just because it is something that can be written for entertainment and profit, that doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't also have higher levels of sophistication to it, especially if it's done well. And that's exactly what the point of this particular course is, and viewing some of these texts from that perspective. And the sense of catharsis, this is a Greek term. So if you're familiar with something like the great Greek tragedy, Oedipus the King, then you might be familiar with catharsis, the idea of purging of emotion, that through the experience of, let's say, reading literature or watching a film or a drama, we basically are able to experience that ourselves in a safe manner and be able to work out some of those feelings. King calls it a kind of dress rehearsal, if you will. It oftentimes is the reason why individuals like to do things like ride roller coasters, for instance, for the adrenaline surge. And the idea is that riding the roller coaster should be relatively safe, that it's gone through inspection and so forth, so that you can experience fear, but you can experience fear in a safe manner. Some people love riding roller coasters for that reason. Some people hate riding roller coasters because they don't like to experience that fear, even though they are going to experience a kind of catharsis. One thing I can tell you though, if the roller coaster ride was something that was happening in your own vehicle, I doubt it would have any kind of entertainment value whatsoever. It would just be fearful, and there wouldn't be this sense of catharsis. So it's oftentimes why individuals at the ending of a roller coaster ride will do things like laugh, because there is a certain pleasure involved with the fear. And I think that's the case with Gothic texts as well, and horror fiction as well. There are some individuals who really don't enjoy being scared and stay as far away from the genre as possible. But then there are others, myself included, who find a certain level of attraction and satisfaction and entertainment associated along with the fear. And I liken it to the adrenaline of the roller coaster ride. And I'm hopeful that if you're in this class, you share some similar feelings to that. I've always said this class shouldn't bring nightmares. So if you're going to be having bad dreams because we are talking about monsters and supernatural entities, then this probably is not necessarily the best fit for you. But this symbolic allegorical representation is something that we will be focusing on over the course of this semester. And even though Gothic and horror literature can be rather predictable and formulaic, it can also be somewhat creative and surprising. Now, in Danse Macabre's second chapter, Tales of the Hook, Stephen King talks about genres. Genres are usually kinds of writings, or they could be kinds of films, where basically they follow certain criteria. In other words, they are formulaic. And because they're formulaic, they usually don't have as much depth or complexity or creativity associated with them, which is why we usually think of them as popular pieces of writing or fiction that are devoted to the masses. And there are lots of different genres. There are westerns, there are romances. Obviously, for this class, we're talking about Gothic and horror. We still need to define both of those, by the way. But that genres oftentimes will blend with one another, and that many of the elements associated with Gothic and also associated with horror can be found in science fiction as well. And if you think about our first text, Frankenstein, where it not only is a text that's done in women in literature, because it was written by a female author, Mary Shelley, and I do this text in my own women in literature class. And not only is it a text that's done in Gothic literature, which I'm obviously doing in this particular class because of all of its Gothic elements, but it also is a text that's studied in science fiction because Frankenstein has many elements associated with science fiction. And if you think about the idea of how, let's say, film happens to be categorized on something like Netflix, for instance, you can oftentimes have something categorized in a section about horror, but it also appears in sci-fi. So you can see that these terms can be blended. Science fiction is usually considered something that is possible, just our science has not come to the point of being able to achieve that. Fantasy, which is another genre that oftentimes is closely aligned with the Gothic or with science fiction, is an alternate reality or universe that does not exist. Think about the Lord of the Rings, if you will. It's a completely new world. Or something like the Harry Potter series, a completely new world. And then finally, what we have are Gothic texts. And while they're often misunderstood, I think that by the ending of the semester, you'll get a sense as to how Gothic texts can not only be literary, but why they are so important in terms of understanding media and popular culture, another interest of mine. Because so many of these texts, especially the first three that we will focus on over the course of the semester, the Frankenstein, the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and the Dracula, have become iconic. And even though individuals haven't necessarily read the text or even seen the original films, they probably have some understanding of the stories. Granted, distorted understanding, but some understanding nevertheless. Just try to go to a Halloween party and not find a Dracula somewhere or a Frankenstein. One of the things that I think Gothic also provides us the opportunity to do, and horror fiction provides us the opportunity to do, is to engage in the deviant, that which we consider to be abnormal. Now, normality is oftentimes a sociological concept that the masses determine what is normal or what is abnormal. One of the best examples I can think of this is an old Twilight Zone episode, and I'm a big fan of the Twilight Zone, the original series, because some of the best short story writers of the day were writing the scripts. So there are literary and ironic elements oftentimes to Twilight Zone. But you may have seen an episode called Beauty is in the Eyes of the Beholder. And basically, this is an episode where there is a woman who has just finished undergoing plastic surgery. We don't see her face, it's wrapped up in bandages for most of the episode. And what we learn is that she has had other surgeries that have been unsuccessful. So the hope is that this is the successful surgery. And we see, the only thing we really see is her bandaged face. And then ultimately the bandages are removed. And again, we just see the bandages being removed and we see her face. And when her face is revealed, by all accounts, we would think that the surgery was quite successful because, again, by our definition of beauty, she is quite beautiful. But then the camera pans out to the doctors and the nurses, and we see that their appearance is quite different. From our perspective, they would appear rather grotesque, these sort of pig-like animals. And of course, when she sees herself in the mirror, she bursts into tears because she's, quote, ugly, unquote, in comparison to those around her, which is why I talk about normality as something that can be very subjective and also can be something that can change over time. Just think about something like weight and how in the past it was oftentimes thought that more weight was more beautiful. If you think about things like the models during the Renaissance, that having additional pounds meant that you were affluent enough to afford rich foods. And now it's the exact opposite in our time period, where it's felt that if you are thin, that means you're affluent enough to afford healthy foods. So again, things can change. They are subjective based on time and place. But if this does allow us to engage in the deviant, that which society does not condone us engaging in, there is a certain amount of dark pleasure associated with that. And what Stephen King talks about is not only does it focus on the deviant, which is what many critics of the Gothic or horror talk about, it more often than not reestablishes the status quo, and that normality is reestablished, or the sociological concept of normality, at the end. So he views these texts as very conservative sorts of texts. And he talks a little bit about, when he talks about his levels of horror, Tales of the Hook And for me, this is page 19 of my edition, where he talks about the most basic horror story he knows, which is The Tale of the Hook. And I'll briefly read it to you. This guy and his girl go out on a date, and they go parking up on Lover's Lane. So anyway, while they're driving up there, the radio breaks in with a bulletin. The guy says this dangerous homicidal maniac named the Hook has escaped from Sunnydale Asylum for the criminally insane. They call him the Hook because that's what he's got for a right hand, this razor sharp hook. And he used to hang around these lovers' lanes, and he'd catch these people making out and cut their heads off with the hook. He could do that because it was so sharp. And when they caught him, they found like 15 or 20 heads in his refrigerator. So the news guy says to be on the lookout for any guy with a hook instead of a hand, and to stay away from any dark, lonely spots where people go to, get it on. So the girl says, let's go home, okay? And the guy, he's a really big guy, with muscles on his muscles. He says, I'm not scared of that guy, and he's probably miles from here anyway. So she goes, come on, Louie, I'm scared. Sunnydale Asylum isn't that far from here. Let's go back to my house. I'll make popcorn. We can watch TV. But the guy won't listen to her, and pretty soon they're up on the Outlook, parked at the end of the road, making out like banditos. But she keeps saying she wants to go home because they're the only car there, and the stuff about the hook scared away everybody else. But he keeps saying, oh, come on, don't be such a chicken. There's nothing to be afraid of. And if there was, I'd protect you and stuff like that. So they keep making out for a while, and then she hears a noise, like a breaking branch or something. Like something is out there in the woods, crying and everything. And she gets real upset, hysterical like girls do. She's begging the guy to take her home. But he looks in the rearview mirror and thinks she sees someone all hunkered down at the back of the car, just peeking in at them and grinning. And at that point, she says, if you don't take me home, I'm never going to go out parking with you again. So finally, he starts up the car and really peels out because he's so jacked off at her. In fact, he just about cracks him up. So anyway, they get home, and the guy goes around to open the door for her. And when he gets there, he just stands there, turning as white as a sheet. And his eyes are getting so big, you'd think they were going to fall out on his shoes. And she says, Louie, what's wrong? And he just faints dead away, right there on the sidewalk. She gets out to see what's wrong. And when she slams the car door, she hears this funny clinking sound and turns around to see what it is. And there, hanging from the door handle, is this razor sharp hook. And notice that while this story might be entertaining, there's no characterization, there's no theme, there's nothing symbolic or creative about it. That's the lowest level of horror. But you can take a story like that and you can build on it and bring things like symbolism and metaphor and allegory and theme and characterization and setting and make a literary piece. So that's something that we will be examining over the course of the semester. Now, in Danse Macabre's Tales of the Tarot being tarot cards that are oftentimes used to tell the future, and something that we will be talking about when we get to texts like The Haunting of Hill House. Again, Stephen King emphasizes this idea that the Gothic is the agent of the norm, that there is a reestablishment of normality. And in fact, when we think about the early days of literature, certainly the early days of drama in England, they began with morality tales. And these were basically tales that were dramatized from the Bible in order to teach a moral or a lesson. And basically wagons would travel from community to community and put on these dramatic performances in medieval times. Not a particularly efficient way to show a drama, and terribly inefficient in terms of being able to collect fees from individuals. So that led to the birth of the theater houses, and that's where we get to Shakespeare. But at any rate, if these are morality tales, lessons for us to learn, and I would argue they are, and not just Gothic fiction or Gothic literature, but I think we see the same in horror film as well. And the adaptations, the film adaptations of Frankenstein, Dracula, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde do that as well, though probably not as and not as a complex way as you might see with the actual written pieces. Oftentimes, film is simplified for the masses, and certainly it is condensed in order to fit into a particular time period. From Stephen King's perspective, there are three basic stories that appear over and over again in the Gothic. And notice how I keep saying Stephen King's perspective, because next class we'll talk about H.P. Lovecraft's perspective, another esteemed author in the horror or the Gothic tradition. That there are three basic stories. The first is The Thing, which he says Frankenstein is a great representation of, some sort of a monstrosity. Monster, by the way, in Latin means to show or to reveal. And I think that's what these monsters or these texts do. The vampire, that which lives off of the life force of another. And the Dracula myth is probably the best example of that, but there are lots of different ways that living off the life force of another can be portrayed. And then finally, the werewolf, the idea of changing into something else. And Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a great example of that. Not necessarily a literal werewolf, but definitely we do see this idea of transformation. If you think about something like the vampire or the living off of the life force of another, we can oftentimes think about that from a biological perspective as well. Now, the difference between internal and from a parasitic perspective, if you wanted to think about it from a biological perspective. Now, internal versus external horror. I'm not necessarily sure which is more horrific. Perhaps a combination of the two. We will be seeing both, where we have the external horror, the monster or the monstrosity, so to speak, attacking. But we will also see the internal horror, the idea of madness or insanity, or the horrors that individuals are capable of committing themselves. There's a great literary tradition of this. If you wanted to think about something like Macbeth, one of Shakespeare's most famous plays, that also focuses on the supernatural being that which cannot be explained through science, that defies the laws of science. Think about Macbeth and the three witches and their prophecies. And there, in many ways, Macbeth works very well as a kind of Gothic text. So I've been using this term Gothic and horror and going back and forth. Gothic is at first an architectural term. So you might be familiar with it when you've heard perhaps discussions about things like Gothic cathedrals, these large buildings that have these pointed arches. It was considered to be an excessive form of architecture, so it was considered to be rather grotesque at the time, though in our current period we oftentimes think of it as quite beautiful and quite majestic. Gothic is also a historical term. So if you know your history, you know about the Goths, who were German conquerors, and they were viewed as barbarians at the time. Now, that term Gothic was borrowed for a kind of literature that first appeared in the 1700s. This is where we find what's considered to be the first Gothic novel. It was written in 1764 by Horace Walpole, entitled The Castle of Otranto. And it basically detailed what seemed to be supernatural elements. You'll notice we're not reading this text in class, and there's a very good reason for it. It's not a particularly well-written text. That said, it led to many of the conventions that we think of when we think of Gothic. And what are some of those conventions? Things like secret passageways and mystery, death, decay, distress, victimization, omens and curses, nightmares, eerie atmosphere. The atmosphere is particularly important. Think about how important atmosphere is for establishing something like Halloween. It's all about this spooky element. Doubling. You will oftentimes see doubling and tripling. That oftentimes is known as the doppelganger, which we'll talk about in class as well. Possible supernatural activity, though it doesn't necessarily have to be supernatural. There, more often than not, is an ambiguous nature to it, so we could use a supernatural explanation, but it could be explained through other means. And in the Castle of Otranto, one of the first things that happens is a seeming supernatural event where this helmet falls out of the sky. Yes, you heard me. I told you it wasn't a particularly well written text. But at any rate, it helped to establish all of these conventions for 1800s Europe. And 1800s Europe ran with this idea of the Gothic, and it focused on some Gothic romances by authors like Anne Radcliffe, which is kind of interesting because usually the Gothic is associated with male authors, or at least the early Gothic. But then when you've got texts like Frankenstein, which was also written by a female author, Mary Shelley, that we'll talk about, or Dracula, written by Bram Stoker, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, written by Stevenson. Then you can see how 1800s Europe basically helped establish what we call the Gothic novel. And the Gothic novel has sort of transformed itself into what we call in contemporary times the horror novel. Now, you can have horror without Gothic elements. You know, slasher films, I suppose, are, or most slasher films, not all of them are a good example of that. However, you can combine the two. You can have horror as well as Gothic elements. And I think you'll see that all of the texts we're reading this semester, even the contemporary texts, have elements of the Gothic associated with them. If nothing else, this focus on the idea of setting. So these were Stephen King's thoughts about horror and about Gothic. I wanted to talk about H.P. Lovecraft next class, and he came out with a very famous essay entitled Supernatural Horror in Literature. And I believe I should be able to find a link for that to provide that for you next class if you don't have access to that. Again, assuming the link is still up and there aren't copyright issues, though H.P. Lovecraft is a much older author than Stephen King, so copyright is much less of an issue. Now, this is a long essay, but it may as well be a very short book, and it is divided into chapters. I can tell you right now that Lovecraft's writing style is very different from Stephen King. Stephen King is very colloquial, very much in the realm of storytelling. He likes to tell a good yarn, so to speak, very informal, as you saw if you read Danse Macabre. The exact opposite is with Lovecraft. He's very academic, he's very stiff and stilted, very much an Anglophile. Even though he was an American, he very much embraced Britain and oftentimes would use things like British affectations, including British spellings of words. And don't be intimidated if you're having difficulty reading Lovecraft. And especially because Lovecraft loves to name drop. So there are going to be references to all kinds of supernatural texts or Gothic texts. And many of them I myself have not read. So don't feel that you should have read them. What's important is just to get a general understanding of some of his main points about what supernatural horror is. And we are going to compare and contrast that to some of Stephen King's arguments about what he thought horror and the supernatural was. And then we'll relate all of this to the idea of the Gothic. So I see next class as basically being the last class of our introduction when we talk about H.P. Lovecraft's thoughts about what is supernatural horror. Keep in mind that as the semester progresses, eventually we will read some Stephen King short stories and some H.P. Lovecraft short stories to see if they practice what they preach, at least from our opinion. And then once we've done that, and I can next class talk a little bit more as well about upcoming writing assignments, we have 2 weeks devoted to Frankenstein, and that's going to be our major Gothic text. And not only did I want to talk about the text, but I wanted to talk about film adaptation as well. So what that leaves for us today is our attendance question, which would be due on Tuesday, 9/14 at 8 a.m. Remember, if you need an extension, just ask me. I'll be happy to grant it to you. Please don't panic if you can't make it. And since we've been talking about fear during this class, my question to you is, what frightens you and why? What frightens you and why? Remember, according to Stephen King, these texts are oftentimes a rehearsal for death, and from his perspective, death is the biggest fear. But I'd be curious to know what frightens you and some of the reasons why. And I'd be curious also to have you read your classmates' responses and see what you think. This would kind of mimic what we would have talked about in class for the second part of this. And remember, there are no right or wrong answers. This is just discussion. at this point, but this will count for your attendance. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about H.P. Lovecraft. Take care. Bye-bye.